Hallo Freunde, willkommen zurück. Ich bin in Nordkalifornien heute und hier ist 10 Uhr und es ist Zeit für .NET API Review. Normality has returned. We have red issues, and so let's talk about one of them. Add binary data.content type 87068. Christoph.
Yes. I assume you want me to describe the scenario and talk about context here?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we added this type, binary data, I think 2 years ago. And it's super successful, kind of more successful that I expected. People love the convenience that it provides, and therefore people want to use it everywhere. So for example, in a lot of models in Azure SDK libraries, models are like the big input structures or output structures. Many properties are typed as binary data. So there are some scenarios where the binary data property is, for example, a JSON payload that a user wants to wrap in some kind of envelope being the model, and there's one property, and the user assigns a piece of JSON that is supposed to be kind of inner JSON of the outer JSON that the model will be serialized to. In some other scenarios, the property may be just, let's say, an image that the serializer is supposed to base 64 encode and send it to the server. Or it's, let's say, a string, and for some reason, the property is not typed as a string, but binary data, because maybe the REST API accepts either a string or JSON payload, correct? So we don't have a common representation for JSON and a string. That is super convenient. So the property would be typed as binary data, and now the user can assign either binary data that contains JSON payload or binary data that contains a string. And there's some discriminator when we send the payload to the server that says, well, the user provided a string, so treat these bytes as string, or the user provided JSON, treat these bytes as JSON. So today, we don't have actually an automatic way to do that. When a user assigns binary data to a property on a model, we literally don't know what's inside, so we cannot do any validation. For example, we expect this to be JSON, but they assigned something that is not JSON. We cannot do this. We cannot send the infer and send the discriminator to the server to tell it whether it's string or a JSON. So those are the scenarios, and we were thinking about, how to address the problem, and then we just thought, wow, it seems to be super simple. We could solve the problem super simply by just adding a content type property. It's not a breaking change. By default, because binary data kind of by default represents just raw bytes, it would be, something like application octet stream. But if we know that the binary data was created, for example, from, serializing an object to JSON, we would know that the content type property should be initialized to JSON. And now we kind of have this additional information attached to binary data that says what is the contents of the binary data. Levi, your question?
Oh, yeah. So I actually had two questions. Yeah, surprise, right? The first is in systemnet HTTP, we actually have a media type header value type that represents the content type. And it gives you a little bit friendlier parsing. So you can say like, oh, this is, this is application/JSON charset UTF-8, and it just kind of exposes all of this for you. There's a concept of parameters and so on. So the first question is like, did you consider using that? And do you have any thoughts on that? The second question is, binary data actually has an associated JSON serializer with it. There's an attribute on it that says like JSON serializer type, binary data, JSON serializer, whatever it is. Does that mean that you have to change that serializer as well? And if you do, is that a serialization breaking change?
Yeah, so the first question, are you asking about the type of the property or whether or are you questioning the whole feature of adding this property? Because the APIs that you mentioned, if I understood you correctly, they are just a bunch of constants that represent various content types. They are not, this one is just a property on the data.
No, so basically right now you're proposing a content type property that returns string. Yep. I was wondering, would you instead consider a content type property that returns media type header value? Media type header value is a rich type that wraps a content type, a char set, and a whole bunch of parameters. It's used in things like HTTP client and across our networking stack. What you're talking about, all those consts, I think are hanging off of the MIME types type, which is a different thing.
Yeah, I think that's, we should discuss it. String, there's some, there's some simplicity in string. Also in Azure SDK, we have a bunch of these constants and they return strings, not the other type. But yeah, I'm open to it. If we think there's a better representation of content type than just a string, I think that would be fine. I don't fully understand the trade-offs. As I said, there are some, string is super simple, people know how to use it. Some of the other APIs, even the MIME type, it's kind of, I don't know how many people know how to use it. It's kind of, I would say, a bit over-engineered.
So I'm going to ask the other direction of question. I don't think we would ever want to put a string label on array, so is this even the right layer for this, or should it be whatever's holding a binary data?
Are you asking about, again, should it be a string?
No, I'm asking should it exist at all? It seems like this property belongs with whoever already has the binary data field, not with the binary data. Because I don't think we would add string intended use onto system.array. So why would we put it on a thing that's just a glorified byte array?
Well, because this thing is building on top of byte array and adding more conveniences. It's about convenience. Of course, we wouldn't add it to an array because it's a very low-level primitive. This one is a high-level helper for operating on arrays of bytes.
Because, I don't know, I mean, to me, using MIME types at all here feels weird. Like, it's just an arbitrary decision.
Is this property intended to represent the actual char set that gets sent across the wire?
Well, there are no chars here, it's just bytes.
Yeah.
Well, the char set is in, like, there is a concept when you're doing an HTTP request or response of the content type header, and the content type header is normally going to be something like text/plain semicolon char set equals UTF-8, say. Like that whole thing will be the content type header.
Yeah. So this string content type, and we can expand it to include more information if you think that it would be good, but this string can be sent in the content type header. So some APIs, imagine that there's an API, it doesn't take anything else, like REST API doesn't take anything else. There's a content, the body of the message, and we are supposed to send something. It can be either JSON or let's say, binary payload, correct? Probably this API would take binary data in as an input, look at the content type property, put the content type property value in the header, and send the bytes in the body of the message, correct? So you're right. In this scenario, we would send it in the content type header, and maybe what you're pointing out, more information is needed than just text plain.
Right. That's what I was getting at. Like, what
Yeah.
aside from octet stream, the things that you have in there are not what modern applications expect to see in the content type header.
Sure. Let's talk about, we could improve it, but let me describe the other scenario where we wouldn't send the content type as in the header, and that is the scenario of there's a model, it has a property that is typed as binary data, and the user can assign this property. Well, we would not use this content type to set it in the header, because we know that the content type of the message when we send it is JSON, because there's this model envelope and it's gonna result in a JSON, basically JSON envelope. This thing is just like one of the properties of the JSON that we are sending, and we would use this content type in various ways. For example, to validate. Let's say the REST API says the whole thing has to be JSON. Well, if somebody assigns us binary data and it's not JSON, we would basically throw an exception. There are some scenarios where those, kind of polymorphic scenarios where there's a property on the model and it can be either a string or JSON. And then we would, or maybe binary and JSON. And if it's JSON, we would send it in line in the envelopes JSON. Otherwise, we would base 64 encode this data and assign it to this property as a string and send it over the wire. So those are I just wanted to point out, we will not always send this content type property over the wire in the header. Sometimes it will be just used on the client logic, that basically serialization logic that serializes the model to be sent over the wire. And yes, I agree with you that when we send the data when we send the content type property in the content type header, it may require more information that it's specified here in this in the list. And then, but still, there's a, we could augment the data. When you call binary data create and you pass a string, we know that it's UTF-8. So that there is a small change to this proposal. And yes, maybe we should do it.
Or I guess the logical next step from that is, if I'm reading one of these things and I need to inspect its content type, do I need to take the string that I'm getting from the content type and pass it through a content type parser in order to figure out what it actually is under the covers? Because that will handle things like char set params and stuff under the covers. Like, string is universal, obviously, but I'm wondering if we're going to end up using a specialized parser internally in order to see what the underlying content type was, if we're also going to be forcing our users to do the same thing. And then at that point, is string really the best representation of this?
Yeah, as I say, I don't have a very strong opinion on what the representation should be. String would work for us. This other type, what is the other type? Remind me, you said?
I put a link in chat. It's
okay.
If you look on HTTP content headers, there's a content type property, which has a return type of media type header value. It's a weird type name, but it is used all throughout SystemNet. And it's used as a concrete representation of not just the content type, but all of the ancillary data that comes along with it, so that you can unambiguously determine what the actual content was supposed to mean.
Yeah.
That said, the reason that SystemNet has this representation is because they expect to send these exact this exact string across the wire. And maybe, like you had just said, that's not always the case in your scenario. Because I'm not pushing back against the scenario whatsoever. I'm wondering, like, are we setting ourselves up for customers to have pain trying to read it back?
Yeah. Yeah, as I said, I don't have a well-formed opinion here. I think if we use the media type header value, I'm looking at it. It's a bit, I don't know. It's a bit
It's heavyweight.
complex, heavyweight. Yeah, good,
yeah,
good, good.
definitely.
So that worries me a bit, but I think it would work for us. We would just extract the content type when we need it. I am assuming it has it. Oh, media type. Yeah, I think we could extract the media type, correct? If we just want
Well,
to know.
you would need that plus a bunch of other stuff, but yeah. But yes. So okay, so that said, let's assume that your team can maybe figure out which representation is the best. What about the other question that I had about are we actually breaking how things serialize? Because right now, if I take a binary data, if I have a model that I'm serializing and that model contains a property of type binary data, and I run that whole model through JSON serializer, it will round trip today. Will that be the case going forward?
Why would it not? Basically, this new additional property, the serializer doesn't care, correct?
Yeah, but that means that the content type won't round trip properly, correct?
Is binary data special cased as a type that it knows can
It
turn into a
is.
data
It is
array?
special cased.
Yeah.
It is special cased.
So adding a property to it would get ignored when serializing and would be populated as default when deserializing.
Right.
Oh, you're talking about serializing binary data, not serializing something into
Correct.
binary data.
Yes, serializing the
Oh,
binary data instance itself. Right now, the way that it works is the entire binary data instance is just turned into a single base64 string and then sent
yeah,
across a wire. It's serialized as a string within a JSON object and then
yeah.
deserialized as a string. What we would have to do is we would either have to change the format that it's serialized in, which breaks down level consumers, or we would have to say, you know what, there's no content type round trip, sorry, which means that the object is no longer being round trip with full fidelity. So just figure out which of the two worlds you want to live in.
Yeah, I mean, and chat also points out that sometimes the content type isn't sufficient, because if you know that your content type is image slash TIFF, but that your bytes actually represent the deflate compressed version of that, you actually, in HTTP land, that's two different fields. One is the content type, what is this after reconstruction, and the other is the encoding, or I think that's the right property, which would say that it was sent using deflate. So I think that this is entirely the wrong proposal, and all of this data belongs at the person who's holding the reference to this, and doesn't belong as a tag on this object.
I'll push back against that slightly, because the content encoding is normally a, like, I'm not going to use the OSI model correctly, but normally that's a transport issue, whereas the binary data type is like an application level concern. So presumably somebody would have unzipped it or reinflated it for you before creating one of these things.
Does
that kind of match your
depends on what your
idea
storage model is.
Well, yeah.
I don't understand the concern, because if I don't, basically the idea is if I don't know or cannot express what this thing contains, I just say it's just bytes. It's octet stream.
Right, but in the case that is being pointed out in chat, it's you do know what the type is. You know that it is a deflate compressed TIFF, and there's not a media type for a deflate compressed TIFF, because it's two different aspects. One is it was compressed with deflate, and the other is that it's a TIFF. And that's a mix of content type and encode. Well, I'm just saying you don't have a way that you can transport that now, so you're going to have to carry this other information along with this object anyway to say, oh, this has already been deflated, so don't run it through deflate again.
Yeah. So the property doesn't solve all problems, cannot describe fully the payload that it's inside. There will be cases where it just doesn't describe it. That is exactly how it works today. It doesn't have enough information to describe everything. And the property just makes it work in a lot of, probably huge majority of cases, be automatic. And it's, in some other cases, the system says, sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. There are just bytes, and I need to know more specifics about these bytes.
Yeah, and again, like the deflate thing really seems like a transport level concern to me. Like that seems like a much lower layer than what this is meant to do. Like I understand the concern, I just think that's a wrong layer to solve it.
It's just, a field that came up as affects the way that the bytes are transported, and I reconstructed it into you've stored your TIFFs in archive storage using deflate already, so that you don't need to pull them out of storage using bigger space and then compress them on the fly and transport them.
Yeah, but if you at the application layer have already like deflated it, like that's on you to know what to do to read it back. Right. Which means that your content type should actually be application / some random custom stuff that I know how to read.
Fair enough.
If you're just sending a JSON or a TIFF payload or whatever, and the network stream underneath you happens to be compressing it, like you really shouldn't know or care about that. But yeah, if you deflated it yourself, you should change whatever ancillary data is needed in order to represent that you yourself did that operation, so you yourself have to undo it.
Yeah, I mean, I can buy that the answer for my scenario is the layer that pulls it out of storage would call it X application / TIFF - deflate, or whatever, and then know how to reconstruct the headers accordingly. But I don't know. The whole thing feels weird to me. But I've said that, and nobody else agrees, so I'll be quiet.
Yeah, like I agree with the concern. Definitely, it's like I said, I think there's merit though to what Christoph was saying about like just keep this a very simple thing for app level concerns, and it will solve 99% of the cases certainly.
Would with content type like change a content type that's already there, or would it only add? Did we talk about that? Sorry, I might have missed some.
Yeah, the type is immutable today, so I intended this method to just create a new instance.
Okay, but it would allow like changing it per se, even though it's a new instance.
Yep.
Okay. And
it
then
doesn't
like if you didn't change it, oh sorry, like toString with row if it was like JSON or something. Or not toString, but like toObject from JSON with throw if it was a string or something along those lines, or
toObject from JSON if it's a string. Oh, I see.
If it's like text plain, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, this is an interesting thing good question to discuss. I actually thought about this for a moment and then didn't kind of decide what is my position on it. We could just say, there is validation. We validate the content type before we try to run the serializer. Or, too bad, we just, the user didn't pay attention to the content type. The content type says that it's a, a string, and they run JSON serializer on it. Too bad, the JSON serializer will fail and will tell you that it was not JSON. I don't have a very strong opinion here. I'm kind of leaning a bit more toward letting the JSON serializer run and make a decision, because we can basically kind of over-validate here and potentially get confused where the JSON serializer would succeed, but our validation logic says that we shouldn't run the serializer.
Yeah, I don't think anything At least nothing at the BCL layer that takes one of these should ever read the content type.
Well, this isn't really a BCL type, but yeah.
No, but we ship out of .NET Runtime the HTTP extensions, the things that have the helper methods on this. At least I feel like we wired up some serialize and deserialize hooked off of this, and I don't think those should ever care, because as you already pointed out, Levi, if the type itself runs through the serializer, we lose the content type.
Yeah.
So,
by the way, just so you know, I had a chat thread with David literally a couple of days ago. I think he saw that I filed this issue, and he pinged me, and he said that he thinks he needs something like this for, I think, in the BCR. We basically were discussing, he wanted to pull it in.
Where's Matt Kanu?
Yeah, that sounds like that should be a separate conversation then.
Yeah.
But all of that said, like I do agree with the point that Jeremy was making, though, in that because you're going to lose data, like you can't really reliably perform validation on this. You can maybe perform a best effort, but you're undoubtedly going to end up breaking people.
Right, and that would be the argument for not validating it when trying to reify the binary data back to a string or an object or whatever.
Ooh, reification. Really.
Okay, whatever. I might have used that word incorrectly.
No, it's great. I love it.
yeah, so it seems okay-ish for you want to slap something on inside your application or framework layer and maybe even take it all the way to tests and say, this is what I expect to be producing. But once you hit a public API boundary and it's being passed in, I don't think anything should ever read the content type. It should, once it has hit the word public, it should now be assumed to be garbage.
Well, but Jeremy, the scenario that we were talking about where the content type from here ends up in a header of a message that we send, that's clearly we are reading. Like we would be reading it in Azure SDK libraries, clearly, for those scenarios. We would have an API, it has an input parameter called binary data, and we would send it over the wire and stick the content type in a header that specifies the content type.
Right. I mean, you're going to have the issue that anybody who's accessing your stuff with a version of this from a library, of an in-market version, they can't set the content type. The only way they can control it is which constructor they called if we do the constructor thing here.
They can set, so today, when they construct the type, it basically doesn't have a content type, and which means we either cannot use this feature or have to use it with some additional API where they can provide the data. But they have an existing code, and it keeps instantiating this thing, and it's by default the content type property will be probably octet stream. Like we don't know what it is. They can call this method with content type and say, I know that it's JSON because I created the type.
If they upgrade.
Oh yeah.
This is
if they upgrade to this.
This is a library that currently exists and is available on NuGet that is referencing a current version of Azure SDK and a current version of system memory or system binary data, wherever you put this thing.
Yeah.
They don't know that there's a content type property. They can't influence it in any way other than which creation thing that they do, and that code needs to continue flowing. That code would need to continue working. Even if that library gets consumed by a .NET 8 executable, which then pulls in this notion of content type and other associated cascades.
I didn't get that because the process loaded new version of binary data or old version of binary data?
Because the executable can cause the target to go higher than the library thought it was going to get. So the library code that's published can't see or set the content type. But the application is now running in a context where it has the newer binary data, the newer Azure SDK, etc. Like, all of these things have to assume that a binary data content type could just be the default because the caller didn't know that there's even a possibility they could set it. It's the common data upgrade problem.
Sure, but I'm saying this is how it works today.
But this goes
Right.
back to my like things shouldn't be validated. Like if we get one of these now and it says go, this is JSON, go hydrate an object from it, it shouldn't care what the content type says because they may have created it with from bytes. They may have created it using a string constructor because they knew they had JSON as a string. Like the content type is meaningless for anybody who's already published a library. Or if the binary data is created by anybody who's already published a library. It's just a hint, basically. And you can say, net new API, you're going to use it, and it's going to be semantic, and you put in your docs, hey, we totally care what the content type is, you better get it right. But...
So I don't know if we need to discuss it, but I understand why we shouldn't be doing validation in this API. Like, there was a question, should from to JSON from JSON to object should it validate? And I think, yeah, now I said I don't have a very well formed position, but I think we shouldn't, for the reason that you mentioned. I have to say I still don't understand why, for example, Azure SDK library that has one of those as a parameter shouldn't use it.
Right. So let's say you have, some existing method foo that takes a binary data.
Yep.
If an existing NuGet package is managing some aspect of something and then calling your foo method, if it created a binary data, the version of the NuGet package that already exists doesn't see a content type property. It doesn't see a with content type method. It doesn't see any of these new constructors. So it will only ever get octet stream, app or text plain, etc., depending on the way that they constructed the binary data. They're calling your foo method. Your foo method needs to keep working. The application they get loaded in may cause a newer version of Azure SDK to be loaded that all of a sudden would care, but you're basically not allowed to care if it's any of these existing words. If it's a new fancy word, you can totally depend on it. But if it's any of the default words, you have to just assume it's unknown.
So let's talk about a very concrete scenario. So when you upload a blob, you can optionally specify content type. So like if you just upload the blob and you don't provide content type, well, there's not going to be content type set in Azure on this particular blob.
That's totally fine, by the way. Like I think chat actually phrased it maybe a bit better than we are, which is like, you're totally free to read it and do something with it. You just can't treat the absence of it as an error.
Well, sorry, I'm reading the next section down that says the existing constructors and factory methods are going to set default values for it. If this thing is null,
which is fine.
If it's nullable and null by default, then sure. Like if you have to opt into this world, then I have way less caring. But if it's going to get default values, then now any API receiving anything on this list can't assume that it actually meant the thing it was. That's just how it got created. You're mixing what the content type is with the way that the person hydrated the object, which may not be the same thing for in-market libraries.
But it's always like the lowest common denominator, right? Like I was going to ask like what empty was, right? Because I assume it's going to be application octet stream. Like I assume that's like null, effectively. Like we don't know. But like if you called like one of the from JSON APIs, like you can pretty reliably say, even though it's an existing API, that's probably JSON. Like right, even though it's changing the semantics of an existing API, like we know that's JSON though.
Well, I mean, if you're passing it into a thing and say go make an object from JSON, then again, that's ignore the content type and just read the data. But if you called binary data.from string, the string could have been JSON. The string could be, any. But you want it to be a string. Like you don't know. You don't know, basically, and especially if they call from bytes, That's just you already did the encoding yourself and passed it in as bytes. So now the thing later that says, oh, if this says application/JSON, I should do something different. Well, what would it have done previously if it was if we didn't have the content type? Now again, I think a lot of this goes away, and we can say if something doesn't have a content type, or if content type is null, and we make it nullable, then that makes a lot of the upgrade easy. It's content type was null. We don't know what it is. Do your best. Whether that's data sniffing or like, assuming a default.
But like people then calling like from string, right, would have to call a different API to then get the default text plain behavior. Like that's just making it less usable.
They'd call from string, comma, text plain.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like making the API harder to use, is it not?
I mean, I'm joined late, so I'm not entirely sure I understand the concern. But basically, there's two things we talk about here. One of them is what is the impact for libraries that take this type now and make policy decisions like the Azure SDK, and they may enforce a content type or a specific content type. That is their decision, right? That has nothing to do with our API, right? And then there's the other part of it, which is do we have defaults or do we not have defaults, right? And I think, from my point of view, I kind of agree with what Stefan just said. It seems reasonable to say we infer a default content type based on which API you called, because that's probably more reliable and probably also easier to implement than any sort of content sniffing, right? And just going down all the way and say, well, if you didn't specify a content type, you just make no assumptions. That is possible, but that seems far less usable in practice, right?
I can imagine kind of doing something in the middle, which is if we create binary data from using this serialization method from object as JSON, we know there is JSON. If we create it, frankly, from string, I know that it's like that. I'm hand waving a small problem here, but we pretty much know that it's a string.
Right.
But maybe when the user just creates it from a byte array, we set the property to null, as Jeremy was saying, because we don't want to run into some of these problems. And if the user wants to say this is binary payload, then they have to modify their code. They have to use the overload and specifically say I'm passing a byte array and it's just octet stream, treat it as octet stream. So I can imagine kind of like having a hybrid here.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Slightly, like, yeah, I prefer that over having to specify the content type for JSON and for plain text plain on the existing overloads, for sure. I slightly prefer leaving it non-nullable and saying like application octet stream. No, I guess I see it, but saying that's the we didn't infer anything kind of scenario, because it's not inferring much. Like application octet stream is not telling you a lot, is it? Like, would you infer anything based on that?
Exactly. Basically, if we leave it as null in these cases, then the user of this property can do the inference themselves. They see a null and they say, well, null means it was not provided. So I'm gonna treat it as octet stream because pretty much it's the same. I don't know.
The only downside with that is that now everybody has to kind of encode that default value, right? Everybody has to type it correctly. They have to know that's what it's called, right? So every time access the property, it gives you a null warning. I mean, it's not the worst in the world, right? If you assume there's very few places where this processing would happen. But I mean, it seems a bit extreme because to some extent, the entire purpose of this type is to just be effectively a container for a binary blob, right? So it does seem reasonable to say, look, unless we know based on the method you called that it's something else, it's going to be application octet string, which is not, I think, a horrible default for this type to assume, right?
Well, one of the problems that came up, maybe this was before you joined, is that if you serialize and then deserialize one of these, the content type disappears.
Oh, because we can't round trip it?
Correct, it won't round trip.
So we already special cased the serialization of the type.
Yeah, and what's the math term? So like this is eventually stable, right? If you like, it's not idempotent the first time, but after the second time, if you make it null, then it is.
Right, because it just gets lost, basically.
Yeah. I don't know. I could go either way on the nullness.
And we have no way to put the content type somewhere in sneakily.
It would break existing down-level callers.
Because they get different payloads back, yeah.
Yeah. Because it's serialized as a string rather than an object, which means that the receiver is expecting a string, and if we suddenly start giving them an object with, say, a content type and a data property, the receiver will throw an exception saying this format was invalid.
Oops. Yeah. I guess that is a fair counter argument. So, Christoph, from your point of view, I assume it's just nice data, right? You're not. It would be nice to have it, and that's why you want to have the overloads that allow you to specify the content type, right? But how much do you care about inference or round tripping?
We don't care about round tripping of the serialization logic. The inferencing, we care a lot for JSON, frankly,
Right.
and and text plain. It's such a rare thing. Like, I don't actually know whether it's a real scenario. I guess it happens, but it's super rare. So I kind of like don't care because it's a very small problem if it doesn't work. But for JSON, we do care. We really would want to know if somebody instantiated binary data using, from object as JSON. We really want to know that it has JSON. Like, it's super useful thing for us.
Right.
For bytes, yeah, as I said, we kind of don't care, and almost like I would prefer it to be null. Now, after this discussion, as Jeremy was saying, like if somebody called from bytes, passed a byte array and didn't pass content type, null is perfect for us, because I agree with, people were saying now the user has to kind of like, has to write some code to interpret the null in some way, as opposed to we interpret it for them.
Right.
But we as, ISVs, we kind of like don't care about this. It's not a big deal for us to write this line of code to do the interpretation and select the right content type if it's null and stuff like this. I understand that maybe for, like the not ISV users, it could be a bit of a hiccup. But from our pure Azure SDK perspective, I would say we care about the JSON case, that it's not null, that basically we know there is JSON. For everything else, null would work. Plain text, I guess, either way.
Could we do something like where we basically have a content type property that is not null, and we do the coalescing from null to octet stream, and then there's a secondary property that says whether we did that or not? Like, I don't know, had content type or something?
I mean, isn't that literally just called a nullable property?
Yeah.
Well, it is, except that nobody knows what, nobody needs to know what that magic content type later is, right? They just get it as a string.
Yeah, Imo is not saying, the difference between nullable property and what I think Imo was proposing is that nullable property, when it's null, well, you don't have the other value. And in Imo's proposal, you have two properties. One has always the value. The second one tells you whether the value was inferred or not.
Right. So then the average guy doesn't have to know that, the default value was octet stream, for example. They just get it as octet stream. And then the few people that actually care, they can just ask, well, did you just make this up, or did the person actually say that?
Like, is this a real scenario? Like, that's the thing. Like, the original proposal doesn't seem that bad to me, because, like, I care about that regular guy who doesn't want to have to think about a default, but, like, I mean, Christoph just said that they don't care, like, whether someone's explicitly set application octet stream or they set nothing at all. Like, you could say, we'll do this for now, and if we find a scenario where people need to distinguish these two things, add the Boolean property later and hope we never have to.
Yeah, I think the only argument against it is that, for the serialization scenario, you just lost data, right? And it appears like we just changed the value underneath the person, right? Because you go from, I don't know, my own content type to octet stream, and all you did was serialize and deserialize, right?
By the way, just to clarify, Stefan, I kind of changed my mind, and as I now basically I would say I would prefer what Jeremy suggested for basically bytes when when the user doesn't specify when we shouldn't be inferring, and the reason is the following. So again, going back to the scenario, there's an API. Let's say we just upload some data to Blob, and if in some cases, like in a case where we know there is JSON, I think it's perfectly fine for us to set the header to JSON, and therefore in blob storage, the metadata property says this blob contains JSON, because it's 100% reliable, and it's like, I cannot imagine a user not wanting this. In blob storage, this additional thing is just metadata. Now, for the other cases, imagine that somebody creates a byte array using a JSON serializer. So the byte array actually contains JSON. And now we upload it to blob storage, and now blob storage ends up with metadata that says, I'm just an octet stream. And I think it may, but imagine that the user uploaded already a lot of data into the server, and they use octet stream as meaning it's not JSON. Now they could be unhappy that we started to stick values in the store that are indeed JSON, but their system interprets them as it's not JSON.
I mean, you could make that argument for like from string and people like stringifying their JSON already, and now it's like text plain when before it was like null. It's like,
yeah.
So before it'd be nothing, and now it's not specific enough, and it's like
you could. I'm kind of like being frankly here. It's not like it's a horrible issue, so I'm being a bit like practical here. I just don't think that it happens in practice with strings, but I can imagine it happening with people manually serializing JSON to byte array, creating binary data from this byte array, and then being a bit surprised that the system claims that it's just octet stream. But I agree with you. Theoretically, the issues are the same. It's just the text is not something that I've seen in practice, or I kind of imagine that it would cause practical problems.
Yeah, I mean, I would be sad to get rid of the text plain inference from string as well.
Yeah.
So, like, if you prefer null on the byte stuff, that's okay. Like now with nullable annotations and stuff, hopefully it's not, likely to lead to bugs, and you might have a better thing than application octet stream for your scenario. So
yeah, it just means anybody who accesses that has to do question mark, and then quote application/octet-stream, right?
Right.
Question mark dot equals.
Or like they might, they might not do that, right? Like they could be like switching over the content type or whatever.
Yeah, that one seems less reliable thanks to casing and shit. But yeah, I mean, I think the question becomes like, how many people will actually read it? If nobody really reads it, it's fine. I mean, another question is like on the main what we just described, should we have either an analyzer or just outright obsolete the existing APIs where the content type would be dropped? Like, for cases where we can reliably infer them, like from JSON or from text, it seems fine to use the existing one that doesn't take a content type, but then or the one that take a byte array, or they you just call the constructor of the byte array. Do we really want people to use them moving forward, or do we really want to say, look, like if you give us raw bytes, you better tell us what they were? I guess it depends on how much we care about the content type, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like Christoph said, like we should absolutely infer for the JSON because we're like never wrong. Um, Everything else is debatable. I'd be sad to lose text plain, but
I mean, JSON is text plain too. So, you know, like
right.
there's some kind of like subtyping relationship here. I guess octet stream is at the top of the hierarchy, and then there's text plain, and frankly, JSON is below.
So I like the semantics of saying like we only set it when we know specifically like what the most specific content type is that we can apply to it. Because it sounds like we're saying we're not going to do the application octet stream default, and that's true. It could apply to any of them, but the text plane has a similar sort of argument where it could apply to JSON, but it's not specific enough. And if it is JSON.
But what you just said is also the reason why I think having a default is reasonable, because it's basically you're never wrong. You're just not specific enough, right?
I most prefer the original proposal. Like I like the defaults for everything. Like if you don't want to you could also choose to treat like octet stream as null for your scenario if you really wanted to. It's really if you wanted to distinguish between not setting it and application octet stream. Like, but no, I mean, I think just assuming the defaults isn't that bad.
Well, I mean, I think like that's the way we're thinking about it in this hierarchical structure, but I don't know that users will always think of it that way. That like the example Christoph said, if it has application octet stream as a user, I might assume, okay, this isn't JSON.
I mean, that's true, but then, I mean, I kind of disagree with what Christoph then just said, because if you give us just a raw byte array and you don't specify a content type, I think us stating this is an octet stream is not entirely an insane inference, right? So if you care about the content type, then, well, then you tell us what it is.
Right.
Yeah, so I think that, you know, the inference would always, we can make it correct. It will always be correct. The proposal, in my opinion, is correct. Those are correct annotations. The question is whether users who already wrote existing code wrote their code correctly.
So, but what happens with blob storage today? Presumably when you don't say anything, they also put some content type in. So I assume the content type there then is also octet, right?
Well, you cannot set the meta. So basically, when you upload the blob to storage, you cannot set the metadata that says what is the content of the blob.
So then it's literally empty, basically?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And in
now,
blob storage, those are distinct, like empty and application octet stream. If you upload that differently, that will be stored differently.
Yeah, because I'm not talking about the actual header when the data is being sent. I'm talking about when the data arrives at the server extracts the header and puts it in basically like a blob metadata, correct? It's not an HTTP message anymore. It's basically some storage data structure. So the data structure that they have is just called like metadata property. They are basically like metadata associated with the blob. You can set the metadata using, you know, many different APIs. It's basically just a dictionary. And
so
it's
for
just,
full fidelity in blob storage, content type simply needs to be nullable. Because before you had the choice to basically not set this at all or set this to any value.
Yeah, exactly. Now the only question there is like, today some users basically don't care about the metadata in storage, so you know they are not setting it. Now suddenly we would start setting it for them.
Right.
Granted, we would be setting it for them to a correct value. we just uploaded bytes. Everything is bytes in networking. So we uploaded bytes. We are not lying. The issue is, do they have a bug where they interpret bytes as not literally what it means? They may be not interpreting it as, well, it's some kind of bytes. They may be interpreting it as, oh, it's not JSON, because if it was JSON, I would be setting the value to JSON. Since it's not set to JSON, it's not JSON, correct? And that is a wrong assumption.
But before it would have not been set at all, right? So like the point I guess I'm making is the decision we make here in terms of whether content type is nullable doesn't necessarily change what the Azure SDK could do. Like the Azure SDK, if it sees application octet stream, could just like not set that metadata. Now that could be bad if you think people intentionally want to set that metadata, which therein lies the problem.
Yeah, and by the way, that just to kind of summarize my position on it, I like some of these problems that we are talking about are like such a corner case problems that I kind of like could go either way. That's to just say that I kind of like, I don't have a strong preference here which way to go. I kind of almost rely on you to put the hat of more general purpose library designers. In a context of Azure, I think the problem is a bit crossing the threshold of theoretical, but I do understand that in the BCL we want to be a bit more careful about this.
Okay, can we call a vote? We've been talking about like the content type nullability or whether we want the extra property as Emo proposed. We've talked about it for a while.
I mean, for me, I think a policy that is easy to explain, right, and easy to understand. That to me, there's only really two ones that I think are workable. Either we basically say we never infer, so we just make it nullable, and if you didn't specify it, it's null, no matter which method you called. Or we are basically saying, look, we will always infer a content type. If you didn't specify one, well, based on the method, we either decide that it's one of the three. And then if you didn't like that one, well, fine, you can specify it, right? There's always overloads for you to tell us exactly what you wanted. I think doing something in the middle where we end up saying, oh, if it's JSON or text, we set one. If it's one of the other ones, then we set it to null. I think that would be highly confusing and people wouldn't understand anymore what values they're getting and when.
Yeah, so I agree with you that there's a bit of value in kind of like, being consistent. But now, think about the following. The user calls from object as JSON. And then we are telling them that they have to now say that the content is JSON. Like, that is also confusing. The user is like, well, didn't I just call a method that I want JSON? And didn't you? Aren't you supposed to put JSON in binary data? Why do you ask me to repeat myself?
That one I agree with. That's why I think my preference is not to make it nullable. I think my preference is to make it always having a value, and we infer it based on what you told us. And if you use one of the super generic methods, well, you get octet stream because, well, it's a generic method. We don't know what it is.
I mean, I thought that the from object as JSON was actually on a different type as an extension method or a utility method elsewhere. But the fact that it's actually on the same type doesn't really change my opinion that the content type should be nullable, and null should mean it wasn't specified, but the helper method of from object as JSON says, I'm the one who created the binary data, I know what it is. And basically, I think nothing else should set it. It should be null in all other cases. I can cave on text plain for string, but I really think that we need the distinction of this was specified versus not.
Okay, well, that also includes the object constructor.
The object constructor and from object as JSON are the same thing. They're just vanity calls.
Fair enough. I mean, I saw someone applaud that.
Yeah, that was me. I don't know if I probably don't get a vote, but I definitely agree with that. Nullable, and then the only one that would set it would be from object as JSON or the object constructor.
Hey, Josh, I thought you were going to be implementing it, so you have the ultimate vote.
Yeah, I don't know that I get a vote, but I just think that losing that bit of information of the default value versus explicitly not set could be a problem. So I prefer like that when we call from JSON, we definitely know what content type it is. For the other ones, we know the top level of the hierarchy, but we don't know the specific content type.
Yeah, but you know, like it does create the issue that Emo brought up, that now it works differently depending which API you call, and now the users will be like, okay, well, I just called this method. Let me check whether content type was set by the BCL team, because otherwise I have to set it myself. And it may not be very visible to the users which APIs do it for them and which APIs they are supposed to be doing this. It is a negative.
Yeah, it's fair. It's definitely an inconsistency. But...
Yeah, I mean, to me it seems somewhat obvious. The from object is JSON, and the object constructor, which again are the same thing, is the thing that it's storing is not the thing that you gave it. Right? You can't rebuild that object. You can rebuild a thing that looks an awful lot like that object, but you can't rebuild that object. You can rebuild a string, especially if you intern it, because then you can get it collapsed back to the same exact reference off the intern table. But the object one is being a transform is being applied, data is being manifested from this input, and it, you know, in some cases it'll be lossy. In all the cases, serialization loses data, and it's different. We know that this is JSON. When you have it from bytes, we have no idea what you did to get those bytes. When you get it from text, it could already be JSON. It could just be plain text. It could be XML. Like, you have no idea what it is, other than it's probably not application octet string. Again, I could cave on you can root the text plain on that one, but once it's from bytes, it's you don't know what it is. And in particular, if this was a brand new type and we didn't have an upgrade problem, I wouldn't care. But we have an upgrade problem.
So Jeremy, but like to a bit playing devil's advocate, the hierarchy doesn't end with JSON. Like,
fair enough.
You could have content type JSON my model name.
Fair enough.
Like, so, like, yeah.
Could we do something like where we say the factory methods, like all the from ones set the content type, but the constructor does not?
I mean, again, that's a really subtle difference on what an existing library is doing when they already had bytes as maybe the output of calling JSON serializer themselves, or, you know, reading a file from disk. Like, the fact that they called from bytes versus the constructor is just a stylistic choice as far as they're concerned, not a semantic one. And now you're making it a semantic one.
Right, but I mean, I tried to like come up with some rule where you can understand it and describe it, right? So it's not completely like, you know, oh yeah, like sometimes you get a content type and sometimes you don't, and well, just go check it at runtime. Seems like a terrible way to explain an API, right? But that's why I have this preference to say we always set one, and if you didn't like that one, well, then you get to set it yourself.
I agree with Emo. It's close. I think we've discussed this for like over a half hour now. I think like this specific issue on the nullability of content type. So like there are two like local maximums, right? Like we either do it just for application JSON or we do it for everything. And like it's pretty split. We don't normally have it this split in this meeting. Like we normally have a better consensus, but I would go with Emo and just do it for all of them. We do like a vote in the chat.
I mean, considering that this type was really meant for the Azure SDK, and they're the ones kind of shepherding its behavior and its design, like, I would be okay with taking the break if Azure SDK is okay with the break.
What are you calling a break?
The break being that there could be runtime behavioral differences between v-old and v-new, depending on what from method you called, things like that. And that some of them would suddenly start uploading headers to blob storage, where previously you might not have expected that, but so be it.
Yeah, one thing we could do, if this is kind of like, it's split, and we frankly don't have a super strong feel which way to go. What we could do is frankly like prototype this feature. And like if we are doing this work, we would almost like we could do a prototype not just of this feature, but also like the integration points. And frankly, like just run tests and run things and see how it goes. And then, come back and basically say, well, we now made up our mind a bit more based on actual changes to code. And here's our recommendation.
Yeah, I mean,
I like that.
the interesting thing in there is, you really have to look and see if anybody in the greater NuGet ecosystem is using it, because they're the ones that are going to cause a version tear. That they wrote their code when there was no content type property. It may be years before they upgrade their library. How is data that comes out of this library going to really flow in the world?
Yeah, it's harder to analyze the whole NuGet ecosystem than
Right, but that's where the
our code.
concern comes in. Is
Yeah.
it's not all these things that basically all ship together, or people who can easily get invited into this meeting and speak. It's what have we done to the ecosystem
But that's
because
not
of
the
what we already
choice you
shipped.
have, right? The choice is not can we analyze the world or not. It's more like do we do an abstract decision right now, or are we doing what Christoph suggests, which is at least giving us some data to make that decision?
Yeah, I'm just saying when we do the data, it's also try and look and see if anyone outside of Azure SDK is using this type, how are they using it, and do we feel that they're using it in a maps to defaults or maps to, oh god, this really needs to be null.
Yeah, we could search GitHub.
But I will point out, the other contentious issue from chat is naming this content type. There have been people who said content type is a thing that is defined by RFC and it should behave like the content type from the RFC. So I'll throw out a straw man suggestion of renaming it to type hint. Or content hint.
I like
So what-
content type, and I think we should maybe consider adding a car set since it's UTF-8, right? Unless everything assumes that. Levi has opinions. I saw him perk up. One video.
We had talked earlier about just using the existing media type value type, whatever the hell it is, that just encapsulates all of these together. The same that the networking stack already uses.
I don't like that because, like, when you set the response header or request header, I guess on the request header it's useful, and that's where it'd be more often used. Yeah. In ASP.NET for like the headers, we normally use strings until we're trying to like parse them, but like for the last mile, if you will.
So what is the problem with calling it content type? Like, how are we violating the RFC?
It's not that it violates the RFC, it's that it's not always intuitive as to how to process it. Like, you can't just do a simple string comparison, for instance. If you want to know if a content type is JSON, like, you're going to have to run it through a content type parser and then pull out the underlying media type and then do things like, split on plus and see if the thing in front of it is application/JSON. Like, you have all of these steps that you have to run through. And is this something that we want to force on customers?
I mean, we don't have to, but like right now we just surface the value, right? If you want to do that, you be my guest, right?
Well,
But I mean,
but now we're just back to all the problems that come with things that are stringly typed, right? It's if somebody really does put in here that this is application/JSON plus JWT semicolon charset equal UTF-8, who in their switch statement is going to have looked for that correctly?
well, I mean, nobody, but I mean, how is it any different from the blob storage SDK taking a string called content type and putting it into their database? I mean, that's basically how this feature is being used, right? Or you set it as the content header when you submit a web request with that payload, right? So in that sense, it is used as what people call content type today everywhere, right? The fact that it's potentially hard to parse is like, well, but that's what content type is. I mean, it's hard to parse. That's why there's an RFC written for it. We don't do the parsing for you. We just allow you to store the value and retrieve it later, right? That's all it is.
Well, but I think the issue is that there are, frankly, two scenarios for this property. One is I'm going to just record it, store it in some database. There will be other pieces of code that will actually try to interpret it. And then
Right.
there's the scenario of somebody's trying to interpret it. And I think what Levi is saying is it's not obvious to people who write code how difficult it is to interpret a property that contains the whole RFC content type. And it's especially dangerous that in majority of cases, it will be super simple. So in
Right.
testing, the interpretation code will just work. And then there's gonna be a bug that is not detected during testing because somebody used the full power of the RFC and said complicated content type. So it is a good issue. It's still a trade-off between simplicity and making it.
Right.
Yeah.
The
So I have a concrete example. So somebody creates one of these things and passes a byte array data and a content type literally of text/plain semicolon charset equals ISO 88591.
Right.
What does your toString method do?
Do the right thing, whatever that is.
What is the right thing? Like, define the right thing, right?
Well, it's not changing as part of the plans, right? Like right now, it just like treats it as UTF-8 text no matter what.
Correct. But if you're accepting a content type, presumably I'm expecting this type to actually do something with it.
Well, especially if you make it a media type whatever ever from system.net and make it really seem like we're doing more with this thing and parsing it more than we actually are. Like I was hoping when we had this nullability conversation that we had gotten off the string conversation.
Hey,
Like
so
the
I have
string
an
is
idea.
easier to use for a lot of cases, like until you want to interpret it, which a lot of people don't, right? Like a lot of people will be just like, just like set the response, content type header, or like, copy it in from the, request, content type header. In both cases, those will just be strings in like an ASP.NET Core app. You can parse it, but like that's more code.
Hey, so what about this idea? We leave it as string and rename it to media type.
Yeah, so that's the next suggestion from Chad is if we don't think that people should be respecting or transmitting the encoding in here, which is a different problem, then the correct name would be media type.
Yeah, I think that's an option. And then we basically say if people start caring about the encoding, we potentially can add additional property and think about all the implications of it at that time. Kind of cross the bridge when we get there.
Yeah, that's probably good. Like if we're not going to add the car setter, I think that does make sense. I was going to suggest adding the car set.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. If there's a better name that describes it, that's fine. I'm just kind of opposing the artificially using different names. But if the actual value is what other people call the content type because it's application/JSON, then well, we might as well call it content type.
Yeah, so I think the thing here is like content type generally implies media type and car set if there is one for like the text, and like we're not doing the car set, so it's not really a content type. You won't want to assign it like directly to the header or whatever, or read it directly from the header.
Yeah,
So,
and I think that's what Stefan just hit at, I think is a key point. Like if Azure SDK is accepting one of these, like there's going to have to be presumably a switch statement somewhere within the Azure SDK that says, if media type is this, set the content type header to be this other thing, and then so on. And then after that switch statement, you can actually upload the payload.
Well, it's possible that we're doing something wrong in the Azure SDK. I'm pretty sure that in a lot of cases, we just set the media type because just media type is also, it's basically it's content type that doesn't use the whole power of the RFC, correct? It's still a valid, media type is still a valid content type.
well, especially for octet stream. For text-based ones, you want a car set, but so many things assume UTF-8 these days that it's probably fine.
Exactly.
Well,
That's what
the problem
saying,
is you might assume it, but the spec actually tells you to do something different. The spec tells you to use ISO 88591 mostly, depending on what spec you're looking at. So you could actually cause errors in the receiver, or not errors, but unexpected behaviors in the receiver if you don't set it properly.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that there's so much code in Azure SDK and other services that like don't set the char set. And it all works because it's all UTF-8, yeah. It all happens to work because it's all UTF-8.
Well, it all happens to work because your ecosystem is the Azure SDK.
Yeah.
Like if your ecosystem expands to include other things that are more RFC compliant beyond just the Azure SDK, then you might see interoperability issues.
Yep, yep.
I mean, the content type would generally be set based on the service swagger. So whatever the service defines as content type for different requests.
Yeah, and I think what I'm saying is in majority, not only majority, I think almost all services, basically UTF-8 is implied. So I've seen a lot of service descriptions that just say, application JSON, and the UTF-8 being, and many other things being kind of implied.
Well,
So what it's
application
worth in
JSON is
ASP.NET
special.
Core, we use the car set typically.
Application
and
JSON
like,
is special.
Yeah.
Or
Because
even,
the
yeah,
RFC for JSON very specifically says you should assume UTF-8. That's
Yeah.
they're unique amongst RFCs in that they specify that, because most RFCs refer back to the original MIME specification, which says assume ISO 88591.
Like text plain, probably.
Yes, exactly.
Alright, so I had already doctored up making the media type, at the time content type null, and then I doctored up renaming content type to media type. So if there's enough consensus, we can call this approved as is, and then let data come back later and say that it should be non-nullable, or it should be non-nullable with a Boolean property of was media type actually assigned. But I think right now saying that we can do it in the nullarity feels like the only way that we're going to end this, move on to another issue before we run out of time for today.
So wait, are we approving it exactly as is, or with content type renamed to media type, or?
Assuming my screen is still sharing, you should see that it's the property is now nullable. It accepts
Could be
null in all
my
the
end.
overloads, and I renamed it to media type.
Does
Your screen
everyone
is
else see
not
like the
sharing.
original
Yep.
proposal?
Yeah, we don't see any
Yeah.
updates.
The YouTube stream is showing correctly, but within our own Teams chat, it's not showing correctly.
Hooray!
Yay!
Stop sharing. Share
Everyone go on YouTube. Woo!
window. Should be this one. Dear Teams, I clicked. And you've decided not to share. Is this that OBS and Teams can't both share the same window? Is this why Emo's state tears all the time?
I just went to the actual issue and I still see the original
Yeah,
API.
I haven't hit post on my comment yet.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry. Teams is now refusing to share this window. So so I renamed content type to media type and made it string question mark everywhere. I also added from string accepting the media type because it looked like the only, when I scanned, it looked like the only input path that wasn't accepting it other than JSON. And we can overload the JSON ones too, but if we think that 99.9% of all callers would be happy with application JSON and not want to specify plus in their extension, then we can let the 0.1% call with content type to update it, which should be renamed to with media type.
Yes, that was in YouTube chat as well.
I feel like for consistency, it might make sense to add it for JSON. Like, even though you could call with content type.
Yeah, I mean, may as well add it, like, because you might have something that is a subset of JSON or something like that.
So, and I guess we should add the string constructor as well, since that one is also creatable from 2 patterns.
So the plan is to only infer application JSON and make everything else null, since everything's nullable now.
Well, I was proposing that we actually infer more, build more than just this type, build basically like parts of storage and some other properties and see if we find any problems.
So if we inferred for everything, right, we wouldn't make it nullable. Like, that's the whole point of inferring. Like, that's to make it more, like, right, to make it so you never have to, like, pick a default content type as the consumer of this, which we may not care about.
Right, because the Azure SDK, when reading from storage, it would get the whatever data type hint is called from Azure Blob Storage, and it can set that as the media type. Because it's a helper library, it'll know about the new property, it can assign it. The question is, existing libraries, when they're calling the inputs, do we take their entry point as assuming the content type? Do we sniff the data? Don't sniff the data. Do we, or do we leave it null? And I think that null is the best answer. And apparently this is the first time I've ever seen us get a notification of congratulations on 100 messages in chat. So this is a chatty issue.
We've sure been talking about the nullability a long time. I do think we just have to go with the decision. So.
Yeah. So because it feels dirty to me to just 100% duplicate the API surface, I've added the string constructor and from string method, but didn't add the media type overloads to the JSON ones, drawing an arbitrary line. We can come back and propose them later. Oh, and then while I updated it in my code window, I didn't actually update it in the proposal text, so this with content type is now with media type. Alright. So can we get a consensus on approving it's nullable, it's called media type, and I added from string and the string constructor? And if this proves to be not what we want, we can amend it later.
Sounds good to me.
Let's do it.
Cool. In that case, I will add that constructor and done.
Oh, by the way, did we rename the with content type to with media type?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, yeah. Again, sorry, the only one stream updates.
Gotta watch the YouTube stream.
Yeah, wait, does Teams think I'm still sharing a window?
Yeah, it shows you it's still sharing. Maybe if you start sharing again, I don't know.
No, I tried that and I hit stop sharing. Now I have the share button, and I tried sharing a window, and it keeps canceling and going back to. According to my screen, I'm not sharing at all. So Teams has just made up data that you're seeing. Yeah, so if you look at the bottom of the issue, that's where all the updated content went.
We're gonna get more viewers just because we're all gonna now watch the YouTube stream.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I was attending the meeting on a laptop, and now I'm on a laptop and an iPad.
give people a minute to see if I messed anything up there. And then I think we can move on to, maybe we'll finish the second item.
Right. Thank you, guys.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Next up, add a JSON converter.type property 63898.
Yeah, I can speak to that. So it's a customer requested issue. Essentially, it's just asking us to expose an internal .type property that's present on JSON converter. So currently, customers don't have a way to actually determine what the actual type being converted is if they don't have the generic converter. If they have access to a non-generic one, there's no way they can do that, save for reflection. So the proposal is to add this internal property to the public API. You'll notice that it is nullable, and the reason for that is that JSON Converter Factory is actually a subtype of JSON Converter, and in that particular case, there's no such thing as a converter type. So it needs to be null just for that case.
According to Robert's Rules of Order, it sounds like this is approved by unanimous consent, unless anyone wishes to dissent at this point.
Is this a new type? Sorry. Because like just adding a new abstract member to the public class.
Correct, but it's going to be sealed in the only two types that derive directly from JSON Converter.
Is it actually non-derivable? Like there's a thing. Oh yeah, because it has an internal default.
Yeah.
Internal things. Okay. Cool.
Yes. So no one should be able to create their own derived type outside the assembly.
No.
So abstract is fine.
Absolutely not.
Any other questions? I should look at YouTube chat. Sold.
Thank you.
We can go faster than an hour and a half. Amazing. Memory extensions contains any except 86528. I thought we did these. Oh, we did index of any, and somebody's suggesting we add contains any, which does the not equal negative one.
So the premise is that this is a optimization and allows us to do tricks that we can't do with index of when you actually need to compute the index. So it's just an alternative for the case where you really only want to know if it does contains. Allows performance and other wins. And of course, we notably have contains and index of already on various types, including in memory extensions. So it just follows the existing pattern.
Okay, the first question that occurs to me without looking up the data is, have we forced on all the existing index ofs somebody who has a writable span, they have to convert it to read-only span themselves to see the index ofs? Or have we actually been duplicating things, and this should include the duplicates for writable span?
I am not sure if we are providing both. 1 second. It looks like we have duplicates of index of any. Yeah, it looks like we have duplicates of all of them. So this should be 6 APIs, not 3. Always forget that extension methods don't work with implicit conversions.
Okay, and then the right, because nobody can see my screen anymore. So then there's a comment of there are actually a whole bunch of overloads of index of any, and asks should we be overloading all of them to contains.
Right.
I'm currently typing things, so I can't actually read what all the overloads are and answer the do they make sense question myself, so I'll let somebody else talk to it.
It's effectively the arbitrary contains any takes a struct search values of t, which allows you to specify an arbitrary number, and allows us to internally optimize the handling of that. For most of the other APIs, we have exposed variants that take 1, 2, and 3 parameters explicitly for the common cases. And then the read-only span overloads as a friendly overload for when people don't want to build the search values themselves. And that one would presumably eventually become params read-only span when that support gets in.
How cumbersome is making a search values?
Is Steven still in the chat? He's more familiar with that design.
I think he had a conflict and bounced.
Yeah, it's not necessarily complicated, but it's not trivial either. And we may or may not be able to optimize it as well, because it is a class that must be allocated.
They said it was a struct.
No, sorry, it is a class.
Okay.
Yeah, it's intended to be something that you create like within your class constructor and then just squirrel it away in a static read only.
Right. Well, it seems like doing span dot contains any of 2 values. If we've made the index of any do that without allocating, it seems like the contains people would want the same allocation profile. And then whether or not it's faster than actually calling index of and returning not equal -1 is like I don't care. But I think people would be annoyed with if they think contains better reflects what their code is doing, but that now they have a difference in memory profile. So we should probably just go ahead and overload all of them. Unless somebody wants to say, dude, that's way too many members, and tell me to just stop.
I mean, I'm fine with just auto-approving all the different overloads there.
As per Tuesday, I have this magical budget of 2,000 APIs.
But I mean, is there pushback to just rubber stamping the general pattern?
We don't rubber stamp in too many cases, but this seems like one of those places where we have an existing pattern, so it's effectively rubber stamped for consistency.
Yeah, I mean, we usually try and write down in the minutes what the actual impact of our decision was instead of just hand waving the pattern. So, but I have
useful.
Included the note that says if I missed any, they're approved too.
So I think we missed some in the back referenced issue for the index of any values API, right? Doesn't that need a span version instead of a read-only span version, or in addition to the read-only span version?
The index of any.
Yeah, in
It
85573
it has a version of the API already that takes a span.
for the index of any values.
No, the values is always read only. This is for this parameter.
No, I know. Sorry, I was just looking at the API approval. It wasn't in there, but I haven't. Has it already been merged? Because the issue's still open.
Hold on, let me double check. We've got so many APIs named index of any, and not all
Right.
of them are the public ones. Yeah, we have index of any system.span. It's already implemented and looks to be public.
And that's with the index of any value string specifically, because that's for the string comparison type thing. I don't think it's been done yet. Anyway, I was just saying it needs to be
Okay.
approved. I linked to it in the Teams chat.
Is contains any except white space really on span of T? Because it only makes sense for char. Or maybe char and char 8.
Contains any.
Well, Levi doesn't even flinch at char 8 anymore.
Yeah, that should be just char.
And I would assume except in range has a constraint.
But I didn't see contains any except white space in the actual proposal, though. I saw it as an alternative design, unless I'm looking at the wrong thing.
But
Yeah,
we were
well,
considering approving that.
Yeah, the alternative design said should we approve contains any versions of everything that has index of any. And
I see, yeah.
and so I've been splatting those in.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The-
so presumably the contains
the-
any
yeah.
in range has a, I comparable generic constraint on it, but it won't compile without it, so we can just say, that I messed up here, and that's fine. I'm just going with how tall is the actual proposal.
I see.
Yeah, I'm trying to find where we have index of any white space. Because it's not implemented yet if we did approve it.
Right.
Okay, that's
So presumably that should be in our
77959.
Nice.
77959.
Yeah.
Which is approved.
Yeah. We
It's just chars, yeah.
and approved it as index of any white space and index of any except white space.
Yes.
Okay, where are my notes?
Which again, on that approval, we only did it for read-only span of char. Is that?
Yeah, that was my question.
Char.
That one only
Okay.
made sense as char.
There's even a comment in there saying that it's mainly expected to be used on string.aspan. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So for the char ones in particular, we don't care about the non-read-only span versions.
I mean, we sometimes do because maybe you have an array and you want to call array.aspan.
Right. Yeah, I guess that's the question. Is it intentional to leave out the span versions?
I
Well-
like consistency across both read-only and non-read-only.
Yeah, so specifically on 77959, the comment that we came to last time was, when looking for consistency, we saw that read-only span of char methods are not entirely consistent with whether there's also a span of char overload. In the event that the span of char members are desired, they're approved by pattern matching. So it's effectively for the general case of T, we've been exposing both. For char in particular, it's been dependent, but if they are needed, then they're just approved because it's consistent with what we've done.
Mm-hmm. And as a restatement, for the record, with 99% confidence, approved doesn't mean will get implemented.
Right.
Sometimes we're rather insistent that if you do X, you must do Y, because not doing Y would be terrible. But the, if somebody comes up and says, "Oh, we added contains any except white space on writable span of char, but we don't have an equivalent index of," then the two answers are add the index of any and remove the contains any. Either way is fine. Okay. This is the contains any proposal. I've hit preview on YouTube. 24 people can see that. Why does it think all the bools are invalid? I don't know. Kevin, fix your parser. I assume you wrote it. I assume you wrote everything at GitHub, being as you're the only person I know that works there.
Should we remove the span contains any except white space, since I don't think we have the index any except white space? I think that's only read-only span.
Sure, I'll go ahead and remove it from here, but it's
such a weird method name.
Yep.
Like I almost want to say for methods like that, we really should break the pattern and
just say that
call it contains any non-white space character.
No, I mean, I would just say get rid of it, but because the English sentence, the English span contains any except white space, and you're like, what?
Yeah.
Which is the
like
if I called trim, would it be empty? is the question you're asking.
The scenario makes sense. It's just
span dot would be empty after trim.
It's not too late to be like index of any non-white space contains any non-white space. None of it's been implemented, right?
Yeah, like I almost want to say like the naming is so weird that we should just name them index of first white space char, index of first non-white space char. Because that is much more explicit about what it's getting back. And to me, much clearer to read.
And contains any non-white space char.
Correct.
Yeah, I mean that sounds like English to me.
Yeah. I know it's a pattern break, but like my mind boggles at trying to parse what we have already approved.
Yeah, I feel like we don't want to. I don't know that we want to use this issue as a statement that we should rename the previously approved ones, but if you want to open a new issue, Levi, to say that after we added the contains, that we should go back and look at these two things and decide that the pattern is wrong and we should make the method names make sense.
Did I break into jail?
Yep.
Thanks.
Well, I think it's if you care that they get changed before .NET 8 goes into freeze mode, you need to open the issue and probably mark it blocking.
I mean, whoever documents these is probably going to be the person who cares that they get changed. I don't know who's going to document them.
Whoever implements
ChatGPT.
them.
Oh, ChatGPT, sure.
Oh, I mean, this is getting really pedantic, but all the additional overloads in the alternative API are generic, right? They're missing the type parameter. But
oh, sure.
Added it.
But that's just like we poke Jeremy and he fixes the thing that's on GitHub, right?
Yep, he's working on it. Find y open parenthesis and make it y t open parenthesis. Let's see how well I can do bulk editing in VS Code. Open that one's char, and this one's char.
And I mean, there's also the T high equatable aspect of that too, I guess.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
that nobody gave the constraints, and the answer is they'll be needed in order for it to compile. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I will write that in. Note most of the constraints. Boom. Okay, left a note that says make the constraints match what the index of any looks like. Had an unfortunate sentence.
And we are renaming index of any except white space to index of.
I
first
think
non-white
Jeremy.
space.
I think Jeremy had said that really belongs in a new issue,
Okay.
and I probably agree with him on that.
Yeah, it feels like a mix of renaming an
That's my
existing
to-do
thing as
list.
part of this feels like a irresponsible use of the issue. Yeah, especially because what we would really do, since the method hasn't been implemented yet, is we should go back and update the old thing, and then it won't show up in the records, right? So we should deal with that from some other process. So the version here matches the name that we used previously. It just highlights that we should maybe go back and revisit those names.
There, I have a reminder set for 3 p.m.
Char.
It'll get punted until next week, probably.
Char. Oh, and I think we decided to remove the contains any except white space on writable span, because we said we probably weren't adding it for index of any. So I'll do that and that. And then we'll stop mixing GitHub edits and code edits. Okay. Less tall than most Tanner proposals.
One was not a Tanner proposal.
Yeah, I was going to say, but Tanner's going to claim it's not a Tanner proposal, because it doesn't say so right there.
This is a proposal in an area Tanner owns.
Fair enough. Okay, I see that it is 11:57 Pacific time, and I don't think there's anything we can sensibly cover in 3 minutes. So,
was there a reason why the I-hosted service startup issue that was blocking? Is there action that we could take to get that looked at next time?
I mean, blocking always means sorts to the front of the list, but the two things that were ahead of it were also blocking.
Oh, I see. I thought the memory extensions. I didn't see the blocking. It was the only blocking one that I saw when we were looking at the memory extensions. I see. So we'll look at it Tuesday. Thanks.
Yep.
That's fine.
Yep. Sorry that you get to listen to us even more, Eric. All right.
No worries. I'm doing the slave driving thing of get it in before preview 6. So. sorry, Steve. Not to be too pushy.
Yeah. At least I don't think I screwed up the agenda.
No worries. It's good.
Oh, I see. That one just wasn't. It wasn't marked blocking when Emo hit the agenda, and I didn't double check Emo's agenda versus Sanity State. Yeah, it'll be first on Tuesday.
Okay,
So,
no worries. I think that gives us enough time.
cool.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks.
Well, thanks to the almost 24 people who joined us today for joining us, though some of you may be redundant with people in the Teams call that decided to be weird with my screen sharing. And yeah, we will see you all on Tuesday on our same .NET time, on our same .NET channel. And since I, for some inexplicable reason, don't travel with a gavel, if somebody wants to mail me a travel gavel, maybe I'll take one. I declare the meeting adjourned with a clap. Auf Wiedersehen.
All my lights just turned off, Jeremy. What have you done?
I now know how to hack Levi's house. Just slow clap.
Yes.